everybody who has had the endurance to stay till the very end. It is greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go, okay. Excellent. Well, today I will be presenting a portion of my CRP paper currently titled Heretical Metatheater, Redefining the Sacred in Terence McNally's Corpus Christi. This project uses McNally's controversial modern passion play and the contentious reception surrounding its original production to examine the complexities of adapting biblical narratives in contemporary performance. Corpus Christi offers a queer reimagining of the life of Jesus and the apostles, culminating in Jesus' crucifixion. The play radically adapts the passion narrative to a late 20th century context shaped by homophobia and the aftermath of the AIDS crisis. Conservative media outlets and Christian advocacy groups, most prominently the Catholic League of America, were outraged by the prospect of the play. Through a public and highly fraught media campaign, which would ultimately escalate to threats of violence and terrorism against the theater, the cast, and McNally, these groups successfully pressured the Manhattan Theater Club to cancel the planned premiere of the play in May 1998, only for the company to reinstate it a week later following backlash from playwrights, cultural institutions, and freedom of expression advocates. The play eventually opened on October 13, 1998, and ran until November 2nd. My archival work at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts this past summer has grounded the research I will be sharing today. My CRP paper seeks to theorize what Corpus Christi reveals about the politics of dramatic biblical adaptations. I will consider how the theater functions as an inflammatory venue for such works, enabling embodied performances of what might be perceived as blasphemous reinterpretations of sacred biblical narratives. I conceptualize McNally as a heretic, not as an accusation, but as a critical framework for understanding a playwright whose alternative scriptural interpretations challenge institutional Christian authority. I argue that his heretical dramaturgy creates space for LGBTQ+ spectators to encounter representation, dignity, and faith-based acceptance on stage. Finally, I will examine the play's overtly meta-theatrical structure and how it invites audiences to engage in the shared imaginative task of challenging and reinterpreting normative theology. Metatheater, a self-conscious form that exposes theatrical artifice, is central to Corpus Christi. From its opening, the production makes its theatricality and artifice clear. The stage is bare, evoking a medieval morality play, and actors frequently address the spectators both as themselves and as their characters. The play opens with a baptismal ritual in which the cast are given their roles, a moment I will examine later. By exposing the mechanisms of performance, the play empowers audiences to recognize its divergent religious message, encouraging them to engage critically and imaginatively with the utopic vision of queer belonging. This self-conscious strategy invites audiences to co-create the story and to imagine a version of Christianity capacious enough to include queer identities. In doing so, McNally positions the stage as a site where the sacred can be redefined beyond the imposed limits of normative Christian belief. So, on May 1st, 1998, the New York Post ran the headline, "Gay Jesus May Star on Broadway," in reference to Corpus Christi's upcoming premiere at the Manhattan Theater Club, condemning both the MTC, the Manhattan Theater Club, I'll use both interchangeably, and the artists involved. The Post falsely claimed the play featured a Jesus-like character who has sex with his apostles, sparking a weeks-long campaign against the play that the Catholic League of America soon amplified. Its president, William Donahue, wrote a letter to McNally demanding that he remove the offensive parts of the script. When McNally declined to respond, Donahue launched a broader effort to cancel the play, denouncing it across newspapers, radio programs, and television as, quote, vile, blasphemous homosexual propaganda, and an outright attack against Jesus and Catholics. Rick Hinshaw, the Catholic League's communications director, conceded that no one within the organization had read the script or viewed any rehearsals. Nonetheless, he still defended the League's statements because, quote, nobody from the Manhattan Theater Club or McNally ever contradicted what was written about it or said it wasn't accurate, end quote. The American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property, as well as morality in media, also issued statements condemning the play's purported disturbing lack of morals and, quote, deep disrespect for Christians by making Jesus gay, further fueling the media frenzy surrounding Corpus Christi. On May 21st, 1998, Lynn Meadow and Barry Grove, the executive producers of the MTC, canceled the production due to escalating security concerns. They reported receiving threats to burn down the theater, kill its staff, and, quote, exterminate Mr. McNally. The decision, however, was immediately condemned by the New York theater community, characterizing it as cowardly and tantamount to censorship. Playwright Athol Fugard, pictured here, withdrew his play The Captain's Tiger from the company's season lineup, accusing MTC of, quote, collaborating in the attempt to silence Mr. McNally. Playwrights Tony Kushner, Larry Kramer, Edward Albee, and Wendy Wasserstein were among the many signatories of various petitions that accused the MTC of, quote, capitulating to right-wing extremists and religious zealots. 1 week later, the Manhattan Theater Club reversed its decision, declaring that Corpus Christi would proceed with its premiere rescheduled for October 13, 1998. The theater worked closely with law enforcement to establish appropriate security protocols and installed metal detectors at the theater's entrance. The reversal set the stage for what became perhaps the most publicly scrutinized theatrical event of the year. Throughout the summer, New York newspapers and broadcast outlets devoted extensive coverage to the forthcoming production, soliciting commentary from theologians, priests, scholars, playwrights, and theater directors across a broad ideological spectrum. By the time the play entered previews, conservative Christian groups had coordinated large nightly protests outside the theater, and counter-protests led by anti-censorship and pro-LGBTQ+ advocacy groups had been organized in response. Theater patrons, critics, and cultural commentators were eager to witness the production firsthand and determine for themselves the nature of the work that had generated months of debate and controversy. The intensity and scale of the controversy surrounding Corpus Christi before its staging revealed a particularly fraught territory occupied by dramatic adaptations of biblical narratives, especially those that introduce transgressive or politicized reinterpretations of sacred material. Interestingly, I have found in my research a surprising lack of scholarship examining the play beyond its fraught reception history. Corpus Christi thus offers a valuable case study for interrogating how paratextual discourse can shape the public's conception and reception of a work before it exists as a realized performance. In Censorship with the Limits of Representation, Xavier Lemoyne argues that the discourses dominating the pre-production reception of Corpus Christi amounted to a form of censorship, exerting, quote, a form of violence that wrested from the play its potential subversive power. Lemoyne emphasizes that censorship operates not only through explicit suppression, but also through the proliferation of discourse that obscures the work itself. The play became known not for its dramaturgy, but for metal detectors and protests. Even the counter-efforts of open-minded critics and supporters displaced attention away from the artistic work itself in their defenses of the play's right to exist. Since the controversy around Corpus Christi unfolded long before the play existed as a staged performance, the formation of meaning around the work did not emerge through critical engagement with McNally's dramaturgical choices, the structure of his adaptation, or the text's aesthetic and narratological elements. Instead, meaning was produced through debates over whether the play was valid, permissible, or morally tolerable. Once reviewers and critics finally encountered the production, it was evaluated as a cultural object whose worth needed to be measured against months of public outcry and the security measures imposed by the MTC. Critics across the spectrum deemed the play not worth the uproar, an assessment revealing less about its artistic merit than about how prior discourses had already, lost my spot. Critics across the spectrum deemed the play not worth the uproar, an assessment revealing less about its artistic merit than about how prior discourse had already narrowed its political and aesthetic possibilities. In Lemoyne's terms, the censorship enacted through public discourse effectively depoliticized the piece, foreclosing its ability to stage queer love, life, and acceptance within a religious framework. 2 months after Corpus Christi closed the Manhattan Theater Company, director Joe Mantello reflected on this process in an interview with playwright Paula Vogel. His comments underscore the extent to which the paratextual discourse surrounding the production had eclipsed the play itself, saying, quote, "When the story broke in the Post, I thought, oh, it's over, it's just done. The plot has been hijacked, and we're going to continue going through casting and design meetings and rehearsing the play and previews, but it's over. The play and the impulse for Terrence to write that play is gone. It's been poisoned." And this is not whether it's a good play or whether it's a bad play or whether it works or it doesn't work. Whatever he was trying to share is gone. It's now been put into a kind of context. So in effect, it doesn't really matter what we do because people's reactions to it have already been colored by what exists, whether those stories were true or not. Mantella's testimony reinforces Lemoyne's argument. The discursive hijacking of the play preempted its capacity to operate as a site of artistic or political meaning-making. Before audiences ever entered the theater, Corpus Christi had already been transformed into a symbolic battleground, one in which the creative work itself was rendered secondary to the narratives imposed upon it. While Corpus Christi first entered the zeitgeist as a controversial queer retelling of Jesus and the Apostles, public discourse quickly moved beyond the play's content. My CRP seeks to pivot back to the playtext by examining how McNally uses metatheater to invite audiences into an imaginative project that expands normative Christianity to include queer belonging. This focus emerged from an archival discrepancy I observed. While the original off-Broadway production was reviewed negatively or at best indifferently, later productions were widely praised. The archive reveals a surprisingly vibrant afterlife for Corpus Christi. Although some productions faced pre-performance backlash, those that proceeded without prior controversy often flourished. Productions in London, Edinburgh, Dublin, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles were well received, with critics noting the play's emotional resonance and ability to command attention. Across these accounts, its meta-theatrical structure emerges as central to its impact. Reviewing the 2001 Chicago Pride Festival production, Chris Jones noted that the, quote, openly meta-theatrical piece contains direct address, creating an ambiance of communal storytelling that is empathetic, elegant, and intelligent. Similarly, Jodie Fleming's review of a 2006 Edinburgh Fringe staging emphasized how the cast's direct appeals created a sense of inclusion, allowing audiences to see that, quote, being gay and being Christian could be reconciled and celebrated. The success of these later stagings demonstrates that Corpus Christi, when encountered without the distorting influence of a paratextual discourse or accusations of blasphemy, can indeed function as a powerful theatrical vehicle, one capable of staging a utopian vision in which queer identity and religious faith are not merely compatible, but mutually affirming. My title, Heretical Metatheater, signals my interest in understanding playwrights who stage transgressive or unorthodox interpretations of scripture as theatrical heretics. Corpus Christi is heretical in its reimagining of sacred narrative and in its formal strategies, which deliberately unsettle conventional theatrical and theological authority. My aim is not to condemn this heresy, but to demonstrate how McNally's heretical approach and his willingness to challenge doctrinal rigidity in both content and form create the conditions for imagining a dramatic world in which faith-based acceptance becomes possible. The play's meta-theatrical choices, I argue, resonate with the goals of heresy. Just as Brecht's distancing effect provokes critical reflection that deepens audience engagement, heretical interventions incite doubt and questioning not to undermine faith, but to strengthen it. In this way, McNally invites audiences not simply to observe this world, but to feel implicated in it, as if they themselves might inhabit a version of Christianity capacious enough to include them. While my broader CRP examines several scenes in depth, for this presentation I'll focus on the play's opening, which immediately foregrounds the constructiveness of the theatrical event and establishes the tone of communal storytelling that shapes the audience's experience throughout. According to the stage directions, the play begins with the house lights still on as the actors drift casually on stage in their street clothes. In the original production, the audience sat level with the stage in an unfurnished, unfinished space with lighting, wiring, and backstage areas visible. The mood is informal and chatty. One of the actors eventually addresses the audience, saying, "We are going to tell you an old and familiar story, one you've already heard over and over, again and again, one you believe or one you don't. There's no suspense and fewer surprises. You all know how it turns out. But it's a story that bears repeating. Some say it can't be told enough." The playwright asks your indulgence, as do we, the actors. There are no tricks up our sleeves, no malice in our hearts. We're glad you're here. Following this earnest and humble welcome, the actors undress and put on the play's uniform, a white shirt, khaki trousers, and bare feet. The actor designated to play John the Baptist then begins a baptismal ritual, during which he bestows each actor with their role for the evening and baptizes them with water. Starting with the Apostle Andrew, John says, "I bless you," full name of the actor playing Andrew. "I baptize you and recognize your divinity as human being. I adore you," first name of the actor playing Andrew. "I christen you, Andrew." This same ritual repeats until all 11 actors are baptized. Following each baptism, the apostle introduces himself to the audience and offers a brief description of his role and his relationship to Joshua. Joshua is the name of the Jesus character in the play and is also the only changed and biblically inaccurate name of the play. This opening sequence illustrates McNally's heretical metatheater in several ways. First, by keeping the house lights on and exposing the stage's infrastructure, McNally strips away theatrical illusion in the same way his play strips away doctrinal authority. The visibly constructed space signals that what the audience is about to witness is not a seamless reproduction of sacred history, but an openly mediated retelling. Second, the actor's direct address reframes the gospel narratives as collective property. When the speaker tells the audience, "We are going to tell you an old and familiar story, one you will believe or you don't," they acknowledge that the audience arrives with pre-existing knowledge, judgments, and emotional investments. Instead of trying to override or correct those attachments, the play invites spectators into a shared act of storytelling. This is a subtle but potent challenge to institutional religious authority. The power to tell sacred stories is redistributed from church hierarchy to a group of ordinary performers and, crucially, to the audience itself. Thirdly, the meta-theatrical emphasis on no tricks up our sleeve or no malice in our hearts also counters the accusations that had circulated before opening night, that the play was deceptive, blasphemous, or malicious in its reimagining of Jesus. McNally builds this counter-argument into the fabric of the performance. Fourthly, the moment when the actors change into their simple uniform costumes marks a transition into a ritualized space. The white shirts, khaki trousers, and bare feet evoke humility and sameness. There is no elaborate scenery, no attempt at historical authenticity, no character-specific costuming. Instead, the company collectively embodies the story. This gesture democratizes the sacred. Anyone can play Jesus, be an apostle, or inhabit the text. In the context of a play so fiercely condemned for queering a holy figure, this universality is deeply heretical and profoundly hopeful. It enacts, rather than merely asserts, a vision of Christianity in which gay people not only belong, but actively participate in shaping sacred meaning. And finally, the baptismal sequence is one of the play's most potent examples of how McNally mobilizes meta-theatrical form to reconfigure theological authority. In traditional Christian doctrine, baptism is a sacrament that confers divine grace and marks a person's entry into the faith. In Corpus Christi, however, this foundational ritual is recast as a theatrical gesture of mutual recognition among actors. The ritual's language is also strikingly egalitarian. Each apostle is described as having divinity because they are human beings, no longer making divinity a metaphysical quality bestowed from above or contingent on conformity to heteronormative Christianity. In McNally's dramaturgy, holiness circulates among people. Importantly, the audience is positioned as a witness and participant in this communal initiation. They are not passive spectators, but recipients of direct address, invited into the ritual space. This invitation marks an early step in McNally's larger project, using theatrical conventions to model a Christianity predicated on welcome rather than exclusion. The baptism scene thus becomes an act of queer theological imagination, recoding a sacrament often used to police the boundaries of belonging into one that celebrates the inherent dignity and divinity of queer existence. The audience is not merely watching a story. They are being invited into a reimagined Christian community defined by recognition, dignity, and love. Corpus Christi became one of the most publicly contested theatrical works of the late 20th century, not because of what it staged, but because of what audiences were told it would stage. Its pre-production reception reveals how cultural anxieties about queerness, religion, and artistic authority can generate a form of censorship. By returning to the play itself, my project argues that McNally's heretical dramaturgy offers something far more generative than the controversy suggested. His meta-theatrical techniques redistribute interpretive power, invite audiences into communal storytelling, and imagine a Christianity capable of affirming queer existence. In its later productions, Corpus Christi demonstrates its capacity to redefine what and who is sacred. In this sense, McNally's heresy challenges us to reconsider who is allowed to tell sacred stories, whose bodies may inhabit them, and what forms of love and community can emerge when theater becomes a space of radical theological possibility. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that. That was super interesting. And I have a couple questions. One is that, so the introductory material that you quoted, is that something that was added to the play after the sort of paratextual sort of controversy had happened, or was it part of the original draft of the play?
Do you mean
the part where, yeah,
this bit?
Yeah, this bit, yeah.
I don't know when, the archive didn't disclose whether, well, this is the opening scene of the play. Like,
Sure.
This is the very first thing that's spoken.
Right.
It's not clear to me whether this was added sort of as a response to all of this like controversy, or whether it had always been in the text.
Right.
That would be something that would be really interesting to find out. If
Yeah.
it could. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm asking because, on the one hand, I mean, you're absolutely right that like the sort of, you know, kind of media circus sort of paratextual thing happening there obviously then imposes like a kind of interpretive framework that seems to sort of, yeah, kind of foreclose a lot of other options, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it makes me think, I teach a class on Todd Haynes films, and one of his first films, Poison, was infamous because it had gotten a small grant from the NEA, and because it showed like, you know, queer sexuality, people lost their minds, and so
Mm-hmm.
when you saw the movie in that moment, you were like, oh, I'm watching this as part of these culture wars.
Yeah.
And then now when I teach it like 30 years later, it's like nobody remembers the culture war stuff, and instead of looking at the movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
That said, it's very rare that we encounter a cultural text without some kind of paratextual expectations,
Yeah.
right? And so I guess I'm just interested in that it seems so deliberate to be like, I am going to guide you, member of the audience, away from like the sort of like expectations that you've been given. And I'm literally gonna baptize the actor into the fictional character so that I'm gonna sort of like stage that transition into the interpretive space I want you to occupy, which is like
Yeah.
totally fascinating. So yes, I mean, it'd be really fascinating to see if there's some way of finding out when that part got added, since it seems
Yeah.
so directly to respond to that. So.
Well, the only thing I can offer at the moment is I know that from what I could tell in the archive, so Terrence McNally and the cast and the director and everybody directly involved with the production made absolutely zero public commentary at all. There was no, there seemed to have been this sort of like internal pact that was made of like, we're not gonna talk about this, we're just gonna let the media be the media, and
Right.
we'll let the play speak for itself. And in the interview that Joe Mantello had with Paula Vogel, which is like a 45-minute interview that has all sorts of great nuggets in it, one of them was that he said that he had no interest in entertaining any theories because he wanted to sort of try and hold on to this idea that he had talked about of trying to allow the play to like just exist as itself and allow it to do the work rather than being in this sort of combative situation of needing to respond to the culture around it. So I could maybe imagine, because of all of that, that perhaps the text did exist, or the text wasn't edited too significantly, because they kind of perhaps knew in the background that they had this planned opening scene, but that's speculative. I don't have.
Yeah, no, that makes sense though. That's
Yeah.
interesting. The other thing I wanted to note, and a lot of other people like, is I'm really interested also in the idea that they have sort of like a uniform that they wear, because it makes me think about the fact that like one of the sort of earliest iterations of post-Stonewall gay male style was a style called the clone style. And it's like literally like all gay men in San Francisco looked the same. They had the big bushy mustache, they had the tight white t-shirt, tight blue jeans, and that, and so like staging a version of that 20 years later, which is to say after, you know, sort of like the worst parts of the AIDS crisis, you know, I mean, I'm wondering if it is a kind of like sartorial callback to this moment of like, you know, first verse of sort of like queer liberation, pre-AIDS, you know, that kind of thing. So that might be worth thinking about too.
Yeah, definitely. I know that there's the archive is just full of all these different headlines and articles. I've given such a short selection of them, but a couple reviewers were questioning what they were calling the J. Crew or gapification of the gay male
Right.
because of this cocky and very kind of normative style. And there's, I mean, you know, this is just the opinion of a critic, but one critic was sort of wondering perhaps if it was another attempt to kind of normalize gay men and not have, you know, sort of have them dress regularly in
Right.
khakis and just kind of, but then there's also this uniformity that I think is also trying to be equalizing and democratizing of the cast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Just because I was also really interested in that first passage, the one that we were just talking about. Yeah. Really quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning the sort of resonance of AIDS, but that was really present for me here as a resonance of this passage. We are about to tell you the story of a gay man dying.
Yeah.
This is a very familiar story to you, but we're going to tell it again.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of wondering about this heretical Christian text. To what extent do you find in having seen a version of the play with in the archives, that there is this sense of we are telling a story of martyrdom. We are telling a story of someone who died for your sins, this cleansing death that made you how much is the heretical connection there a connection between the cleansing death of Jesus who died for our sins and this story of AIDS in America and some of the men, I'm thinking Ron Hudson, but some of the men who died for our sins and the really complicated resonances of that.
Oh my gosh, you bring up such a great point. So a couple things. One of the things that is really interesting as well about this sort of production history of this play is that it actually opened the day after Matthew Shepard was murdered. So Matthew Shepard, who was murdered in Laramie, Wyoming for being gay, basically, and became a major national headline. And that was a major talking point in a lot of the headlines, and the reception of this play was sort of, there was one critic who said you know, I feel bad reviewing it negatively considering the cultural moment that we're in of we've just lost Matthew Shepard. And there's a really interesting preface that's included, that is written by Terrence McNally, that's included in the play script that was written for the published version, where he essentially equates Matthew Shepard to being our modern day Jesus. And if we can't accept Matthew Shepard, then, you know, who is this young gay man who was brutally murdered and martyred, is his assertion. You know, that just kind of proves that this play and the challenges that it's pushing on audiences who are coming from a perhaps conservative Christian perspective, it's just evidence that the play should exist because it is challenging us in that way to empathize with martyred gay men, essentially. And then also later in the play, because it does follow the passion narrative as it appears in the Gospels quite closely, and in the moment, I'm forgetting my passages or something, perhaps you can help me out, but when Jesus cures an incurable man who's sick, in the play, McNally cures him of AIDS. So AIDS is very much a topic in the play that is constantly kind of whispered at, and then that is one scene where it comes out in full force, this discussion of one of his miracles is healing this man of AIDS because he's not afraid, almost in a Princess Diana way, not afraid of hugging him and touching him and being there with him. And that's a big sort of effective moment of the play that happens sort of in the second half of it. So yeah, it's very much in conversation with that, totally. Yes?
I thought the opening was so interesting, and the way you're talking, I mean, the whole piece was interesting, but the opening about how the culture wars shape our reception of a text, both in the near term, and then you talk about the long term, this play being produced over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's such a live topic, given that like our current moment
Yeah.
really has a lot in common with the 90s culture wars, and what you talk about is like works of art being turned into a symbolic battleground, whether that's like a novel, which happened regularly then and now, or visual art, like maybe the NEA, His Christ scandal, another. But I wanted to ask you, what is specific when the art object is an embodied art object? When the culture wars are centering around something that's an embodied piece of dramatic art,
Yeah.
you know, the corpus part of corpus Christi.
Absolutely.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Either the stakes of the culture wars or the shape of them when it's an embodied art form?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on that. I mean, I think that something that my CRP and probably most work I do on this topic moving forward is going to be trying to contend with performance and embodiment when it comes to these dramatic biblical adaptations that are especially transgressive. Because I think I would say that I think the fact that it's a story that relies on embodiment and seeing this controversial, you know, it's not just kind of like a story on a page that exists over here and you can choose to imagine it however you choose to imagine it. But the conditions of the text have it so that it is performed. And you are then putting a human body into this character and forcing audiences to not really just like imagine it, but to confront what that looks like. And I think that in terms of the culture wars, I think that additional step of, I think it can also be made in film and television as well, where you're putting a body into these characters rather than just kind of allowing them to exist as words on a text and in the imagination, makes the threat of them so much more real and so much like harder to avoid. I also think as well that the situation of off-Broadway is really interesting in this conversation because it's, you know, the sort of New York theater community is the sort of mecca of North American theater, and as a result has so many different sets of eyes on it that make it so much more susceptible to being picked up by the culture wars. Whereas a lot of the smaller productions that succeeded were in really small venues. Like they were in major cities, but a lot of them were staged as part of queer theater festivals or part of, there's what they call a life-affirming church in LA that did a production of it in 2006. And it was staged within the church, and it was like a community organization event. And, you know, I do think it's worth mentioning in the context of this play that a lot of the successful venues, or a lot of the successful stagings were in hyper-controlled venues that weren't quite so open to like a larger media influence, which I think still speaks to the merit of it, but I think also sort of suggests that perhaps it falls into a category of work that needs to be, maybe perhaps isn't for mass consumption, but it would be interesting to think of what would need to happen in order to bridge it into being palatable for mass consumption. Yeah. Yeah, we'll start there. Yeah.
Maybe building on Xander's question, I'm thinking about like meta-ness in general.
Yeah.
And whether there are specific affordances to meta-theatre that also kind of position it in a particular way in terms of vis-a-vis culture of all the historical stripes, right? Like the relationship between the stages of the play of meta-theatre and then the kind of meta-commentary you said already right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Like is the aesthetic dimensions of the play and political, the noise around it, always at odds with each other? Or is it somewhere in which if the play, as you described, is like revealing as an artifice and also then inviting the audience to participate in the way you described, is there something else about inviting beyond the scope of a single play, beyond the single night, right? Like involvement of socio-political forces more broadly, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is that opening out that way?
Definitely, that's an interesting question. I think that, probably yes. I think that if a play is sort of operating in a meta-theatrical framework, and it's asking more of audiences than traditional realism, I imagine that, I think you're right. I think that it probably would then invite perhaps additional discourse and discussion in the sort of like meta paratextual framework, certainly. That's interesting. I'm definitely going to think about that.
It's like, is meta theatricality
Yeah.
its own form of heresy? Or like it's blasphemous
Yeah.
on its own, but that's part of the threat. Is how, at
Yeah.
least how I take that question.
Yeah, well, and I think something I said at some point whenever I was saying it, but at some point, is that one of the reasons that I've brought heresy and blasphemy into heresy and metatheater into conversation with each other is because I think they kind of operate on the same, operate in a very similar way. Of they're both kind of challenging, like formally challenging people to sit back and reconsider, kind of in the Brechtian kind of alienation distancing effect. I kind of interpret heresy to be the same thing. Of it's not necessarily coming from this sort of, you know, negative accusatory background as it's often kind of synonymized with blasphemy or sacrilege.
Didn't Burke write a Galileo play or something?
Yeah, which is another great example to throw in here. But yeah, I think that the whole idea of a heretic kind of taking on a meta-theatrical task of like forcing people to look at things differently by kind of deconstructing the form in some way is a big part of what I'm interested in.
I think we're having a great time.
Oh,
This is great.
oh no.
Thank you. Thanks to all.